Good afternoon, everybody, those who are present in the room and those who are with us online. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center, and we are delighted today to be able to feature the work of Joseph Torigian, who is, as I think all of you probably know, an assistant professor in the School of International Service at American University. He is also, we're very happy to say, very involved with the Wilson Center. He is a global fellow at our History and Public Policy program, and he was also part of our inaugural group of China Fellows. It's a project that we run here every year for leading young sinologists with the support of the Carnegie Corporation. And that was how I first became aware of your work, which I've been very happy to follow ever since. Joseph has a long list of academic accomplishments. I will not read all of them. I believe in short introductions. But I do want to emphasize that he is both a Russian and a Chinese speaker, which is essential to his own scholarship, and that kind of depth is also very important to the Wilson Center. He has been affiliated with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and he was a Fulbright scholar at Fudan University in Shanghai. He earned his PhD at MIT and his BA at the University of Michigan, and I gather you're heading back there again. His work has focused on the politics of authoritarian regimes, with a particular focus on elite power struggles, civil-military relations, and grand strategy. And this current book is, I think, a mix. I'll let you characterize it, but as I was reading it and reading about your own background, there's comparative politics, it's political science, it's history, and it's illuminating both the political trajectories of China and of Russia itself. The book that we're discussing today is Prestige, Manipulation, and Coercion: Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao. So what can we learn from palace shenanigans in both places after the deaths? And I was naturally thinking of the movie The Death of Stalin. You're probably sick of hearing that as I read it. And of Van Thurston's Private Life of Chairman Mao. Both came to mind.
Well, you know, Palace Shenanigans was the first title of the book.
Palace Shenanigans would have been good. But I've got a number of questions, as I'm sure our group will too, but first we want to hear from you about the book. We have an online audience as well as an audience here in person. For those of you who are in the room, know that you are not on camera right now for the live stream. The two of us are. But should you ask a question, and we hope you will, first push your microphone button, you'll get a green light, and then one of these cameras will pivot over and you probably will feature online. So I think that's how the tech is going to work. Is that right, Lucas? And I'm joined by Margaret Myers from our Asia program, who's been instrumental in setting all of this up. So thank you for your help. And I'm now going to turn it over to Joseph Torigian and his clicker.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to Lucas for organizing and to Robert for that very generous introduction. I want to begin by emphasizing one of the things that you just said, which is how supportive the Wilson Center has been for me over the years. The History and Public Policy program, as many of you I'm sure know, has a digital database which is essential for anyone working on the years that I'm working on in this book, but also just the hundreds of people who have been trained by the Wilson Center for these yearly seminars on how to do archival research. I know a lot of people donate their archives once they're done with them, or even before they're done with them, to the Wilson Center that then go on to the database. So if you're trying to find a lot of the stuff that you see in the footnotes for my book, I may have found them in the Wilson Center, or I may have given them to the Wilson Center. So if you want to see whether or not I have the correct read on a particular document, then you can draw upon the amazing work that they've been doing here to do that. So the book is about the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1957 and China from 1975 to 1981, which of course are periods of transition after the deaths of Stalin and Mao. The conventional view of these transitions is that they had a lot in common, that there was a confrontation between cohesive groups over economics and politics, and ultimately there was a triumph of reformers over so-called conservatives or radicals, and that the victories of Nikita Khrushchev and Deng Xiaoping were the result of a victory of inter-party democracy and collective leadership. This understanding of politics as about exchange is very similar to how many political scientists have theorized about Leninist regimes. That's not surprising because the Soviet Union and China are very important, so political scientists have looked at these cases to draw bigger conclusions about how Leninist regimes work. And I think that I can summarize three main elements to this school of thought that together see politics essentially almost like a market, as a system of exchange. First, that the leader who provides the more popular policy platform or patronage model is successful. The second is that there is a defined group within the leadership that is enfranchised to select who that leader is going to be. And finally, the military and the political police don't really have a significant role. This, of course, drawing upon people like Samuel Huntington, who famously argued that Leninist regimes stand out because of the power of the civilian leadership over the military hierarchy. So to see whether or not that historiography stood the test of time and whether or not that way of thinking about politics is an accurate one for thinking about Leninist regimes, I investigated new primary sources, memoirs, and interviews to look at the four cases that you see on the slide right now. In the upper left-hand corner, thankfully, as you said, there is this movie about the death of Stalin, so I don't really often need to remind people who Lavrentiy Beria is. But there's one chapter on him. In the upper right-hand corner, some of those characters were in that movie, but in 1957, the so-called anti-party group of Molotov, Kaganovich, Smolenkov tried to prevent Khrushchev from starting a new dictatorship within the Soviet elite. They had a majority on the Presidium, which is what the Politburo was called at that time, but Khrushchev, for reasons I describe in the book, was able to emerge victorious. In the bottom left-hand corner, we see the trial of the Gang of Four. And finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see Hua Guofeng, who was Mao Zedong's initial successor. And looking at the new material that we have on these four cases, we see that actually this was not a politics of exchange, but a politics of personal prestige, historical antagonisms, backhanded political maneuvering, and a substantial role for the specialists in violence. So the two of the most important successions in 20th century history were not so much victories of reformers over conservatives or radicals, as previous accounts have suggested, but a settling of scores. So if you only remember one slide from this talk, this is a summary of the theoretical arguments of the book. First, that it's personal prestige and compromising material that are more important than patronage or real policy differences. Second, that it's the manipulation of ambiguous rules as opposed to canvassing for support within some defined group. And finally, that the position of the military and the political police have an extremely important role to play. Now, in the book, I go a little bit more into detail on how institutions do matter to a certain extent. One way is that for these individuals, the party meant everything to them, so that when they lose the contest, they don't go and start a new revolution. And also, when it comes to the military, it's not so much that they are competing with the civilian leadership, but that when there are openings and disputes among the civilians, then they can be brought in. So they're a little bit like vampires, or you need to be brought into the house, invited into the house, but once they do, they can really do a lot of damage. So because this is a China group, I thought that I would spend a little bit of time talking about how it was possible to make this revisionist history, and it's certainly not easy. As many of you know, the current leader in China, Xi Jinping, has talked about how competing narratives about the past of the Chinese Communist Party are existential threats to the regime. He uses this term, historical nihilism. You may have seen recently an article in The Economist about how hard it is for people to do research on China. But perhaps surprisingly, when it comes to elite politics, the amount of stuff that has become available and how much has been used, there's really quite an extraordinary gap between the two of those. So in that sense, I think that there is still work to be done, even though it is getting harder, and I want to be clear about those restrictions. So on this particular slide, in the upper left-hand corner, you see something that's colloquially known as the LA collection. It's a company in Los Angeles that sells, I think hundreds, maybe even thousands now, books to American libraries. I believe Princeton and Harvard and UCLA have full collections, but you can get them from interlibrary loan, and they're full of primary sources, documents, memoirs, other material intended for internal circulation. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the Chinese Cultural Revolution database, which is run by a scholar named Song Yongyi, which has primary sources just not for the Cultural Revolution, but the entire history of the People's Republic of China. The bottom left corner, the University of Freiburg has the Maoist Legacy database, and then there are also a lot of internal histories that are available at American institutions, and then of course there's the Wilson Center's digital database that you can go and see as well. You can also buy a lot of material on Confucius.net. If you don't want to, I'm sure you know a library that would be interested in purchasing that material. You can get really quite good stuff there. Also in Hong Kong, you could buy material that you couldn't get in the mainland. On the far left of this slide, what you'll see is one volume of a 10-volume set that was published by Chinese University of Hong Kong. And what they did was they invited the PRC's greatest historians to write about the periods which they had mastered through primary sources and interviews. And many of them work within the system, Chinese universities, and have quite good access, but decide to publish this material in Hong Kong, where they don't have the censorship sensitivities that they do in the mainland. And then, of course, Hong Kong is been a place where people on all kinds of the political spectrum in China go to publish their memoirs. So the gentleman you see in the middle is Deng Xiaoping, who was a famous so-called notorious leftist in the 1980s. His uncensored manuscript was published in Hong Kong. But also, as you see in the far right-hand corner, people like the daughter of Hu Yaobang, the pro-reform general secretary in the 1980s, has also published in that city. And I have good news too, that Hong Kong is still playing this role. There is a new book coming out that is a chronology of Kang Sheng. And the author has, I did an interview with him for Jordan Schneider's China podcast, and says that he has also kind of a revisionist view of him, just as I kind of have a different view of the Gang of Four, so I'll be very much looking forward to that as it's coming out, I think, in the next few weeks. And then finally, you could actually find really surprisingly sensitive articles on China's past in party history journals that were published in China. So in the far left-hand corner, some of you might have heard of this journal, Yanhuang Chuanqiu. Of course, it was reorganized in 2016, and it hasn't been publishing the kind of things that it was before that. But for a long time, they would publish on everything from June 4, Cultural Revolution, land reform, Great Leap Forward, and all that stuff is still available in American libraries. So I have two China chapters, and since I want to have time for questions, I'm not going to talk about the Gang of Four so much today, but if we want to do that in the Q&A, we can. So I'll focus on Hua Guofeng. So many of you may be wondering why I'm talking about somebody who for years was seen as sort of a very transitional figure who didn't matter so much. But I think it is relevant for people who are following China today, because often when you see an article about China, you see one of two memes. First is that Deng Xiaoping started Reform and Opening at the third plenum in 1978. And the second thing is that Deng Xiaoping institutionalized a system of collective leadership and really cared about institutions and constraining what the top leader was able to do because of the lessons of the strongman era of Mao Zedong. So we see that a lot. In fact, we've seen it, I think, in both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times over the last month in these comparisons between Xi Jinping and Deng Xiaoping. But people who studied Chinese history, when they hear of Hua Guofeng, they hear that he was dogmatic, that he had a radical ideology, that he tried to block the rehabilitation of old revolutionaries, that he had his own faction, that he was deeply unpopular. But what the evidence now shows is quite a different story. That actually Hua was quite popular in many corners of the party, that he did not have his own faction, that he wanted to work with the old revolutionaries and in fact saw them as natural allies. And in fact, he, not Deng, deserves credit for starting many of the elements of Reform and Opening. And finally, that his defeat was not this a wonderful story of a manifestation of collective leadership and inter-party democracy, but was essentially one of Deng Xiaoping's machinations and manipulation of rules. So those of you who have studied Chinese history might be rolling their eyes at me and wondering how I could say this, because if they've heard of this thing called the two whatevers, right? So what are the two whatevers? Well, the two whatevers was this formulation that appeared shortly after Mao's death that made it look, including the people within the elite at that time, that Hua Guofeng was declaring that China was not going to be moving away from the Maoist model, that maybe they would get a little bit of a cultural revolution light, but there wouldn't really be a fundamental change. Now, that was a misunderstanding, but what's interesting about that misunderstanding is this isn't just a case of dumb Western scholars not understanding China, but people within the PRC, including at the very highest levels, also misunderstood what this represented. What Hua Guofeng was trying to do at this time was rally to the idea of Mao and the memory of Mao to give cover as they were moving away from Mao in practice. So the challenge was how you do that in a way that doesn't destabilize the entire party, but give you cover as you, in practice, rehabilitate old revolutionaries, move away from the Maoist economic model, that kind of thing. And as they tried to do that, they came up with this term in a process that Hua Guofeng was not fully on board with, and led to this unfortunate outcome for him. And in fact, at the third plenum in 1978, he did a self-criticism in which he said, "At the time, I did not consider these two expressions completely enough. Reflecting now, if only I had not raised the two whatevers, things would have been fine." So this is a picture of the father of Xi Jinping, Xi Zhongxun, whom I am writing a biography of, allegedly proposing the special economic zones to Deng Xiaoping. Now, this painting appeared a few years ago, and it sort of shows Xi Zhongxun as the paragon of reform and opening, as the person who deserves credit for the special economic zones, and Deng sitting there and obviously smiling to give his approval. And this probably never actually happened, this picture. So this picture allegedly happened at a work conference in April of 1979. Deng was not present. There are different versions about whether Xi and Deng even met in April. Now, Deng did make remarks around this time that were supportive of the idea of the special economic zones, but unambiguously, the individual who deserves credit for giving approval to the special economic zones at this time was Hua Guofeng. In fact, we have primary sources from Guangdong that show when Xi Zhongxun went back where he was the party boss, he talked about Hua Guofeng. Deng came up, but primarily he was grateful to Hua Guofeng for giving approval for this. I'm going to use another terrible expression. People might have heard of the phrase, "practice is the sole criterion of truth." So this was another sort of famous moment in Chinese history that I think has been misunderstood. So this phrase, "practice is the sole criterion of truth," appeared in a newspaper. And the story is that it was a pro-reform, anti-Mao formulation that then Hua Guofeng, because he was a leftist, tried to quash. And that over that year, numerous provincial and other high-ranking leaders expressed a position that they agreed with it, and then this manifested ultimately at the end of the year at the work conference and was this wonderful story, again, of inter-party democracy. But this was a misunderstanding of what had happened. So when this phrase first appeared, it was not about Hua Guofeng at all. It was essentially an academic, theoretical conversation. But Deng Xiaoping was upset about Hua Guofeng's inroads into the military at this time, for reasons I go into within the book, and decided to essentially weaponize this debate because he was upset both at Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing. Wang Dongxing, who was the head of propaganda at this time, did try to quash it, that's clear, but Hua Guofeng was either passive or, at the very least, definitely was not opposed to it. This is very clear that we now have from this evidence. So you may be wondering, if this is the case, then what in the world did happen at the third plenum? What was the dispute that led to this this outcome? Well, the problem was that even though Hua Guofeng was fully on board with rehabilitating old revolutionaries, it was really, really, really hard to do that. Why? Because when they started investigating these people, they realized that they couldn't just blame it all on the Gang of Four, that there were other people who deserved even more blame, people like, maybe not surprisingly, Mao Zedong, but Zhou Enlai as well. So Zhou Enlai, as we're learning more and more, actually wasn't this kind of person who tried to protect, but when they did these investigations, realized that he was the one to blame for a lot of them, which means that it's really hard to reverse these verdicts, even as people were already returning to work. So Xi Zhongxun was already in Guangdong, but his case was still unresolved, right? So these old revolutionaries at the work conference before the third plenum started complaining about this, and that's really what had happened. And it put Hua on the back feet, but on the eve of that conference, we have archives showing that he was fully on board with moving away from class struggle as the key link and moving to economic modernization. And in fact, Hu Yaobang, during the work conference, went home and said to one of his children, Hua Guofeng, in one swipe of the pickaxe, broke a hole in the dike. Just how big the flow of history will make that hole is completely up to the power of the people. That's Hu Yaobang crediting Hua Guofeng for the breakthrough at that plenum. Finally, I want to talk about this very famous speech that Deng Xiaoping gave on August 18, 1980. Why is this speech so famous? Well, in this speech, it looks a lot like Deng is making a programmatic statement in favor of collective leadership, overcoming feudal legacies, creating real institutions. And it's because of this document that many people to this day believe that this is something that Deng Xiaoping really cared about. But we now have new evidence that first of all shows that the timing was very curious of this particular speech. It was given shortly after Deng appeared to conclude that Hua's popularity was persisting, especially within the military, especially at lower levels for people who had joined during the Mao era, and that he needed to come up with a formula, an expression, a slogan to justify a more aggressive posture against Hua Guofeng. Now the timing is very suggestive of this, but it's not just my interpretation. So Deng Liqun, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, when somebody asked him about this speech, he said it wasn't what Deng really thought. It was in actuality directed against Hua Guofeng. It was preparation for Hua to leave his position to find a theoretical justification. And Zhao Ziyang, the general secretary who was purged in 1989 because of his support for the protesting students, said at this time Deng was just addressing Hua Guofeng. He was struggling against Hua Guofeng. And he said this when somebody asked him, why didn't institutionalization happen when Deng gave this speech? And also we can show that Deng didn't really believe this because of all of the evidence over the 1980s that I won't go into now. So then what was it about with Hua Guofeng? Well, one thing was that he didn't have the prestige and the status of Deng Xiaoping. So the Chinese Communist Party was based on a political culture that co-equated your authority with when you joined the revolution, what you did during the revolution, your ability to show that you saw further, that you thought deeper, that you suffered in a way that revealed your dedication and also reinforced that dedication. Hua Guofeng joined the party much later than Deng Xiaoping. He didn't have that kind of status, which led some people to believe that he had helicoptered to the top in an inappropriate way. But they also used compromising material against him. So what you see in this picture is called the so-called 8-person picture. And it shows Hua Guofeng with members of the Gang of Four in a way that suggests that he was closer to them than was previously understood. And it was used effectively against him. But what this picture doesn't reveal is that he had already started the move against them at this particular time. So this was important, but also Deng would do things like wait for when Hua Guofeng made a trip to Europe and then meet with dozens of people to say that Hua needed to go. And in fact, rearrange the military hierarchy while Hua was not present within the People's Republic of China, and would allow for discussions of Hua essentially when it was good for him, and not allow discussions about Deng when it was bad for Deng. So it was the story of, not a story of people sort of meeting in groups to objectively and openly discuss whether they wanted Deng or Hua, but a manipulation of the institution. So because this is an Washington, D.C., I'm sure all of you are waiting for me to wrap up to say what some of the policy relevance might be, which is what I'll do right now. I think one clear implication is that those people who are hoping for an elite revolt, who are hoping for another third plenum, don't have an understanding for what the third plenum in 1978 was all about, and that ultimately these systems are not popularity contests, and that the individual at the top can draw upon a lot of other tools other than popularity in terms of whether their policies are good or whether they're seen as competent or incompetent, that these discussions of Xi Jinping breaking the mold and becoming a new strongman leader and violating these institutions that Deng Xiaoping had created are a misunderstanding of how Deng thought about power. So I will stop there, and I'll be interested in your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, both on the Russian and the Chinese side, so we look forward to hearing from you. One question, if we start off, and then
Sure.
I'll go to the audience in the room, but if you're listening online, you can also send in a question. And Lucas, where would that?
On the webpage.
It's on the webpage. Please feel free to submit your questions if you're online, and we'd love to have you participating. You began by talking about the Western historiography that you're to some extent writing against, Huntington. What about the historiographies in Russia and China themselves? What are you writing against, or does this accord more closely with traditional understandings? And if it's not too speculative, how do you think that this work would be received by contemporary scholars there?
So that's a great question. The reason we have such a wrong understanding of Hua Guofeng is that after he was removed from power, you needed to have a justification for what had happened. And you don't want to talk about the things too openly that I discussed in this set of remarks. So they said that Hua Guofeng was this individual who didn't care about collective leadership, who was anti-reform, who was anti-old revolutionaries, and all of this was essentially a legitimation narrative for Deng Xiaoping's ascension to power. So people have probably heard about this new history resolution that came out in China maybe about a year ago. Well, the second history resolution happened over 1980, 1981, and part of that was Deng Xiaoping's claim to power, and he included a section on Hua Guofeng that was the sort of conventional narrative to justify his new status as the core leader. But at the same time, I want to emphasize this very strongly, even though that's the party history view, that has changed a little bit in official versions when you read about how the party talks about Hua Guofeng. They're not quite as negative about him as they were in the past, although we haven't seen a full sort of rehabilitation. But more importantly is that this book, as you said, is partly political science, partly history. But to a very, very significant extent, it's also a work of translation, because this book would not have been possible at all if not for Chinese historians at Chinese institutions who were pushing the envelope and pushing against this conventional view. So for example, if you look at some of those party history journals that I mentioned, or you go to Hong Kong, you can see especially one historian I'll name in particular, Han Gang at East China Normal University, who, drawing on his work, as you'll see, I quote him extensively in my book. So this idea of Deng is actually, I think, among party historians in China, they know better than many Westerners do, because they study this, so they know the evidence and they know what happened. So,
You didn't quite imply this, but I thought you came close to it, so I'll ask. Might there be an interest among contemporary leadership in somewhat revisiting and breaking down the traditional Deng legitimacy narratives that deal with collective leadership and smooth transitions? Am I pushing it a little too far?
That's a great question. So there is this view that Xi Jinping is rejecting Deng Xiaoping, that he is doing it both in terms of his policies and he is doing it with the way that he is talking about party history. There's a lot to say about that. The first is that whether or not he in practice is moving away from the Deng model requires looking at a whole host of different issue areas. And if you line them all up, I think it's ambiguous, right? In the sense that in a lot of ways there is continuity with the past. And that Xi Jinping is someone who is a politician, which means that he has a very conservative side to him in the sense that he cares a lot about ideology. He persecutes dissidents mercilessly. He believes that people really, really need to have a sense of idealism and motivation and treat the CCP as a real Leninist system where you have a collectivist ethos. And but at the same time, he is someone who I don't think is blind to the need for economic growth. I don't think he's blind to the need to address unemployment. I think he recognizes the importance of having Western business people having some confidence in where the regime is going. We see that he can maneuver when it comes to his relations with Russia and Europe, and it seems that his meeting with Macron recently has demonstrated that there is some effectiveness to what he is trying to achieve. So in that sense, what's changing we need to be a little bit cautious about. In terms of collective leadership, he's similar in some ways to Deng, but he's different in others. He's similar to Deng in the sense that both of them unambiguously believe that this is a system that only works with a core. And that if you don't have a core, you've got a lot of problems, right? But Deng, and I'm sure that Xi Jinping knows this history almost better than anyone because his father was proximate to Chinese history because his father was a very high-ranking figure into the early 1990s, that there was a lot of pathologies to the way that Deng ruled. Because Deng was the person who had all of the power, but he wasn't involved in the day-to-day decisions. And that meant that both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang did things that led Deng to conclude that they needed to go. And those were very destabilizing for the system. And then in 1992, he nearly removed Jiang Zemin at all. And if you go back further in time and you see Mao, you see that this succession program of naming someone before you resign is like a recipe for disaster in a lot of ways. So in that sense, I think that because Xi Jinping has not named a successor and is both the core and involved in day-to-day decisions, is different from Deng in a way, even though he definitely is very similar to the core. But finally, I want to say is, even in the way he talks about the Deng era, he is extremely careful. He is extremely careful not to reject reform and opening. This is very clear. Then the question becomes, why is that? Well, one is, as I said, I don't think that he doesn't care about economic growth. I think that still is a priority for him, even though there are definitely some clear changes in emphasis. But his family story is a story about the dangers of competing versions of history and how destabilizing those conversations can be. So Xi Jinping's father in 1962 was purged from the leadership because of him supporting a novel about a revolutionary who was his mentor in the Northwest that was seen as challenging Mao as the only person who could come up with the right way to fight a revolution. And then, so that's one thing. So for him to go and start, changing how the party's conclusions about the past looked like, that can really upset a lot of people, and that's not something that, for someone like Xi Jinping, for whom the party's interests come first, not individual interests, is something that he wouldn't like. And then also his father supported the special economic zones, as I said, right? And his father's, one of the reasons Xi Jinping was, people hoped that he would be a different leader was because of the memory of the father. And that's a different story I don't want to get into. But the way that Xi Jinping talks about reform and opening is he says that reform and opening created real problems that everyone wanted to solve, meaning presumably Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. But they weren't solved because the party wasn't disciplined enough and there wasn't a strong enough leader at the core. It's quite a clever formulation in the sense that he can distinguish himself with his predecessors without rejecting the predecessors, while also at the same time tell a story for why he deserves all the power that he's bringing to himself. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but it's a complicated one, which is why I kind of took the time to go on a little longer than I should have. Yeah.
Why don't we open it up to the room? I know there's a lot of expertise here, and we focused so far mostly on the China half of the book, but you're open to Russia questions as well, right? Because I know that there's some Russianists here as well, so it's really all fair game. If you could please push on your microphone so you get a green light, and if you have a question, please identify yourself if you could. And then, again, if you're watching online, please feel free to use, I guess, the button on the event page to ask a question if you like. Simon.
Well, I'm Simon Shuckett. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. And with respect to the Hua Guofeng issue, as it happens, I first went to China in October of 1978, and I left in, I guess it was March of 1981. So the period of the fall of Hua Guofeng is one that, on the one hand, I knew nothing, I understood nothing, I didn't speak very much Chinese and so on. On the other hand, it was what was going on around me.
I should have interviewed you for the book.
Well, in any case, so one point on Hua, which is that when I first arrived, which is a little bit before the third plenum, the big issue was the rehabilitation of the Qingming demonstrations for in memory of Zhou Enlai.
Yep.
And there were two comments that I recall, or two attitudes I recall regarding Hua. One was people sort of made fun of his calligraphy. It's very simple, not very cultivated, and the implication was that Ganbu like him, cadres like him, didn't have the educational formation that the older generation had. But the second thing, which is more important, is that people thought that his endorsement of the rehabilitation was a little, something wrong with it, because he had been the Minister of Public Security during those demonstrations, and therefore was directly implicated in their suppression. And they were, I mean, they weren't suppressed the way they were in '89, but they were suppressed. So that's one point. The second thing is that it's my impression that the rehabilitation of Hua starts getting force after June 4th, and that giving credit to Hua for reform and opening and so on is a way of rebalancing Deng Xiaoping, and people who are not going to criticize Deng for having suppressed the democracy movements can nonetheless take away some of his aura by doing that. So I think that's an element that is worth considering in that.
Yeah, so with regards to the rehabilitation of these protests, I'll take a step back and explain to people a little bit more what you're talking about, because it is a very important question. So people know about the Tiananmen protests in 1989, but some people might not know about other protests that happened in 1976. And they started as a commemoration for Zhou Enlai, and then they were it doesn't look like people were killed, but they were forced out of the square by I believe public security units. And so after that was over, there were debates about whether the protesters should be declared, the label of counter-revolutionary should be removed. And according to the old historiography, this was another one of the axes of debate that made Hua unpopular, and that because he opposed this rehabilitation, he was punished politically. I talk about this in my book, but there is a full article, because this is such an important question, written by Fred Tevis and Warren Sun, that show that even on this question as well, it was a complete misunderstanding, and that Hua Guofeng was basically on board with the rehabilitation and supported it and deserves credit for it. So I could have talked about that as another one of these famous things that that people had misunderstood. And in terms of who deserves credit for reform and opening and that kind of thing, Xi Zhongxun said in the 1990s that we shouldn't give Deng credit for everything that happened in reform and opening. And he would know, in part because of the special economic zone story. And he may also have been thinking about Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang and those people who also deserved credit. So when you read, as I said, official versions of Hua over the last few years, in some ways they're actually closer to what had happened in terms of their description than how Westerners understand it. And even the official kind of Chinese version has moved farther along from the Western consensus of this, but it's still a careful rehabilitation, right? It's more like what they don't say, right? And it's just more broadly positive as opposed, but it definitely doesn't have anything negative about Deng Xiaoping or anything like that. And we know that lots of the family members of friends of Xi Jinping have gone to Xi Jinping saying, this needs to have a full rehabilitation. People might have heard of Gao Gang, who was the first great purge of the People's Republic of China. He hasn't been fully rehabilitated. There has been some changes, but Xi Jinping, when he was still alive in the late 1990s, said, "How can it be that Chen Duxiu, who is one of the first heads of the party and later became a Trotskyite, has been rehabilitated, but Gao Gang hasn't been rehabilitated?" Right. So if Xi Jinping was sort of uncautious with history to fulfill his father's sort of own understandings of who deserved what, then we would have seen a lot more change in history than we do. So I think he's actually quite cautious in many regards, in that sense.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk, Joseph. I'm Emily Matson. I'm at American University in the Asia Pacific Diaspora Studies program. And I had two questions. I'll try to make them relatively brief. First of all, as a historian of modern China, I'm very familiar with historians, including guiltily myself in the past, of kind of dismissing Hua Guangfeng as being almost like Mao's lackey. You mentioned in your presentation that one of the reasons for why he has been considered, very much anti-Gaiga Kaifang, anti-reform and opening up in China has been this legitimization narrative for the ascendancy of Deng Xiaoping. But I was wondering if you could talk a little more about why this has persisted in Western scholarship, this idea of Hua Guofeng as just, Mao's lackey, the kind of like the two whatevers stereotype. And then I had a Russia question as well, which is, you mentioned in your book the case of Trotsky and why didn't he pull a Deng Xiaoping move, as it were, since Trotsky had a lot more revolutionary credentials than Stalin did. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well. Thank you.
So Trotsky, because that is the most obvious counterexample, is in the conclusion. So, but let me talk about your first question. Why is it that these ideas of Hua Guofeng that are incorrect have persisted? I think there are several reasons for that. The first is wrong versions of Chinese history don't go away. It's not just Hua Guofeng, but that this sort of what people learned in college, they just kind of always assume to sort of always be true, so to speak, or people often also will read memoirs more than history, and they'll treat those conclusions unproblematically. I think that when there is a winner and loser in China, the winners get to tell the story, and that often has a big impact on how Westerners understand what had happened. But for example, people even now think that Liu Shaoqi and Mao Zedong had this competing relationship, and that they both represented two factions, with Mao, the revolutionary modernizer, and Liu Shaoqi as the bureaucratic, as the true bureaucrat. And that happened much earlier even than Hua Guofeng, and people still have this kind of misunderstanding of what Liu Shaoqi was about. Why don't they go away? I think one reason might be disciplinary, in the sense that for years people weren't doing a lot of research on elite politics in China, and the people who were in their 70s and 80s, and so and I think in history part of it was people were doing really terrific social history that deserves to be done, but not a lot was being done on elite politics. And then in political science, a lot of people were doing quantitative methods, which I'm not criticizing quantitative methods, but they were doing that and not doing the sort of qualitative history kind of style that Ezra Vogel or Roderick McFarquhar or Fred Tevis or Warren Sun were doing. And so it wasn't getting done, and in the meantime, people were reading popular histories. And the last reason is that there's a lot of path dependencies, right? Like once a story gets out there, it's really hard for it to go away. So, yeah. Oh, and then on Trotsky, I'm sorry, briefly, you're right. Like you would think that. What you didn't mention was that we also often hear stories of Stalin as coming to power because of his reliance on the bureaucracy and his reliance on regional officials and promising. And the famous word that Sovietologists used was the circular power. I'm not remembering it exactly, but it's basically very similar to the ideas that political scientists used for Khrushchev and Deng. But the new evidence shows by people like J.R. Getty that people didn't understand any policy differences between Stalin and Trotsky, and they thought that it was entirely personal, and that actually those people from the regions weren't beholden to Stalin because he promoted them. That was a misunderstanding that's been corrected with the archives. And when it came to Trotsky, he had a lot of prestige as the hero of the revolution, but he had a lot of baggage. One was that he was Jewish, but also he had criticized Lenin in very tough terms, and Lenin had criticized Trotsky in very tough terms, and Stalin used that compromising material very effectively against Trotsky. So.
I have another question, but would like to go to the group first. Anything else here at the table? Yes, Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret Myers. I'm a scholar here affiliated with the Latin American program in the Kissinger Institute. I do wonder if you could just give us a little sneak peek into the Gang of Four conclusions. What about that narrative are we misunderstanding?
Yeah, so we think of the gang as acting in a very coordinated way. We think of them as being very aggressive, and we think of them as having their own policy ideas that they were pushing for. But what the evidence shows is that they combine those aggressive tactics with a desire to coexist with other members of the leadership. They actually were fully supportive of Hua Guofeng, and over 1975 and 1976, we have primary source material of Jiang Qing essentially giving an olive branch to those people who had been persecuted, and her doing a self-criticism. But it was the interesting kind of self-criticism in which she said, I was in charge, so I need to do this, but I also want to say that the violence of the early Cultural Revolution was something that I opposed. And she said, I suffered a lot and you suffered a lot, we should all get over it. So she was very clear about this kind of language, using this kind of language actually. And when Deng was kicked out in 1975, the person who triggered that wasn't a member of the Gang of Four, it was Li Xianyan, who was one of the old revolutionaries, right? They also did not really have their own policy platform. What was their policy platform? Well, it was trying to guess what Mao wanted and give it to him. Jiang Chunxiao, for example, when people would say, is there Jiang Chunxiao thought? He would say, absolutely not. I am just Mao's secretary. And part of the reason for that is he had seen what had happened to other secretaries, including one that had killed himself, Deng Tuo, and understood that his job was to interpret Mao and not to do anything other than that. But again, their most serious problems were historical. These were people who joined the revolution much later, right? And some of them had compromising material floating around about them. Jiang Qing told one American interviewer that to understand her life, they should read an essay by Lu Xun called Gossip is a Terrible Thing. And her whole story was essentially about her battles against character assassination. It was really kind of a fundamental thing. And then finally, they had a lot of popularity within the party. I mean, one of the most interesting things in the book is that when they were trying to figure out what to do about the gang in 1976, they couldn't decide at first whether they should confront them at a meeting or arrest them. And they decided to arrest them because they were afraid what would happen is what had happened in the Soviet Union in 1957, which is one of the cases in my book, which was that Khrushchev was a minority in the Presidium, but by drawing upon Marshal Zhukov, who had this prestige as the general who defeated the Nazis, and he literally put compromising material on his opponents in the hands of Zhukov, so it was like a 1-2 punch. And Zhukov used the military to fly in the Central Committee, so when the Central Committee meeting was held, they overturned that decision of the Presidium. So the fear was that you have a Politburo meeting, and the Central Committee say, you don't have a right to do this to us. We want to have a full Central Committee meeting. Politburo doesn't have a right to do this. And then it would just completely get out of hand, and you wouldn't know what would happen next. So that's sort of the Gang of Four and how it fits into the theory. So.
I wonder if we could come back to the structure of the book as a whole. Do you find instructive parallels in the management of the deaths, aftermath of the deaths of Stalin and Mao, in the comparative aspect? And if so, what did that look like? What did the structure of your book lead you to conclude?
So the way that I structure the book is I present these two different understandings of politics that I began my talk with. And then I say, well, that's fine, but how do you operationalize that for a political science book? So what I do is I ask very specific questions of the evidence that show whether the answer is yes or no. And then I do that in order, the exact same order in each chapter, essentially. And so what that does is it shows that the theoretical framework is strong enough to show what was going on in both cases, but it's not a sort of covering law political science approach that says that the exact same thing happened, because there was a lot of context and contingency that were quite significant. So the biggest and most obvious difference is that in the Chinese case, there was a reassertion of the old authority structures that existed before the Cultural Revolution. These people who had been promoted rapidly were essentially pushed out by the old guard and began this era of what Fred Tevis calls old person politics. But in the Soviet Union, the exact opposite happened, right? Because in the Soviet Union, what happened was the mid-generation pushed out the older generation. And what's so interesting is that it's not because there was a different political culture in China and the Soviet Union. What you see is that these people like Molotov and Kaganovich and Voroshilov, they had awesome power because they knew Lenin and they were there at the beginning. And so that's one of the reasons why Khrushchev felt so threatened by them. But that the context was different because they also had bloody dossiers, essentially, right? That they were could be seen to have, they could be shown accurately to have killed a lot of people in the 1930s, right? So when you have Marshal Zhukov, who had that, who was so significant for the reasons I described, we have literally a full transcript of the Central Committee plenum in 1957, and it begins with Marshal Zhukov reading these documents, saying, all of you people thought that they were heroes because of when they joined the revolution and what they did. But let me read this to you. And then Molotov and Malenkov say things like, you just heard a very selective, history, and it was a selective history because Khrushchev had special access to these files, right? So in that case, the outcomes were very different, but the theoretical, I think, perspective can explain both of them.
Maybe one last question. You've got one back here?
Sure.
Here comes the second to last question.
Hi, I'm Peter Ceskeen, fellow at the Wilson Center. And I was going to ask you to elaborate the comparative perspective a bit more, since you just covered that. I mean, I'd just like to push you a bit further. So do you have any bones to throw to political scientists at all, really? Are there any generalizable conclusions that would describe the functioning of power transfer in Leninist states and authoritarian states, or that would give us some mechanism for predicting what might come when the man behind you leaves the scene? If we were at the Kennan Institute, perhaps you'd have Putin up there. So are there rules, generalizable rules or mechanisms that apply to both of your cases, or that apply to the historical figures you cover and the two looming figures who we all think about today?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So at the School of International Service at American University this semester, I'm teaching a class on qualitative methods. So I'll need to be careful and not be too political sciencey and jargony about how to think about generalizability and prediction and that kind of thing. But this book is a little bit of a response to certain political scientists who look for average causal effects or look for particular constellation of variables that has either a necessary or sufficient condition relationship. And when it comes to just one or two cases, I don't think that you're getting a lot out of the variation in the two, but that you can get a lot by looking very specifically at particular episodes and then use them to theorize about the broader structures and mechanisms that cause that particular outcome. So what that doesn't allow you to do is predict what's going to happen, because you know that some set of variables has a relationship with another set of variables, but it does give you heuristics or tools or concepts that allow you to structure problems. So using this book to look at what Xi Jinping is going through right now would allow me to say a few things, and I guess this is a good way of tying the book into the present day as well, that, well, whatever happens after Xi Jinping dies, it probably won't be a contest of different policies, right? That probably the same things that we were describing here would continue to shape that outcome. But like what you fill in those what would fill in the blanks, how you would fill in the blanks of how it would play out, you would have to wait until then, and it would be hard to predict, right? So you could sort of get a sense of possibilities, if not an exact answer. But in terms of succession, I'll say one other thing, which is that I think that Xi Jinping has ended the succession because successions are really dangerous, and he really understands that well because he understands party history. And in fact, when you read intellectuals surrounding Xi Jinping, they say things like, succession is a moment of profound danger for us because Westerners who are betting on colored revolutions look to generational turnover as the best way to destroy us, essentially, right? So if that's how you think about succession, it makes a lot of sense not to have a succession, but Xi Jinping is mortal, and he presumably would like to guide a little bit what happens after he goes. So how would he address this challenge? Well, based on everything we think we know about him, it seems to be that he doesn't want there to be even the hint that there are multiple headquarters within the leadership, right? So people thought last year that Li Keqiang was sort of doing his own thing, even though I don't think he was, and that's exactly what Xi Jinping doesn't want. And I think it's one of the reasons why he picked Li Keqiang as his successor, so that people wouldn't keep saying this kind of thing, that there was somebody, trying to start something, start something new, or opposing him, or having their own line. So it's hard to like pick a deputy and sort of test them and give them power to help to see just how good they are, but also to help them develop their base, because it's dangerous, right? And then the other thing too is, we know from the past that succession politics a lot of the time are about personalities and political skill. And those are the hardest things for people on the outside to see, right? So how somebody manages their relationship with Xi Jinping can really matter a lot, and Xi Jinping's probably looking at multiple different people and judging them as he tries to figure out what he's going to do. Events are also really important, right? Like if there hadn't been June 4, Zhao Ziyang probably would have been the successor, I think, right? So those kinds of surprising things can happen as well. And Xi Jinping is probably changing his own mind as he's watching and seeing what happens. So what happens to Xi Jinping may affect Putin's calculus, and what happens to Putin may affect Xi Jinping's calculus. Because we saw Deng and Mao were constantly looking at other Leninist regimes and drawing conclusions about their own positions in terms of succession as well. So I can sort of give you some things to look at, but I can't tell you what will happen. I think would be one way of thinking about prediction in political science.
Sir.
I'm David Cowling, retired from State Department.
You are?
Very much enjoyed, yes,
Yeah.
yes. As I look at these things, well, first of all, I think about, compromising material. I mean, there's Kompromat in Russia, and there's this wonderful website, kompromat.ru. On the Chinese side, there are accusations of corruption left and right, but I always wonder the use of say, compromat analog in China. And the other really bigger question that I often wonder about is that what does this mean for Chinese people's understanding of their own history? I like the books and magazines you mentioned. Personally, I found...
No, you know them very well, yeah.
Well, not as much as I should. But on YouTube, there's just tremendous videos, lectures by Gao Hua and Shen Zhihua and other historians of the party. In fact, Shen Zhihua, in one of the YouTube videos, he points out that the Chinese people and Chinese officialdom have great ignorance on the history of China's foreign relations, particularly with the peripheral countries. And Shen Zhihua's great line was, when Chinese diplomats lie, they should at least know when they're lying. And they don't. Now, I see almost like breadcrumbs. There's lots of great information out there. There's, of course, Hangang and these other sources. And then when I hear about scholars in the party school, a lot of them are very critical about Chinese history, but then it's like breadcrumbs. Like when I was working on environmental issues in China, there were lots of people outraged. Even the head of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, in the middle of a 700-page book, he wrote on page 500, if we build the Three Gorges Dam, future generations will never forgive us. But things like that never hit the press. So there are people who know, and then in contact with people like yourself, there's this great rising generally of Chinese academic standards, and there's this great conflict. So what does this mean for Chinese academia and the closing of the archives the last 20 years,
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. When Xi Jinping first came to power, I mentioned this earlier, people thought that he would be a reformer based on their understanding of his father. And we know that liberal intellectuals in Beijing saw the first warning signal that they got it wrong in the speech that Xi Jinping gave on a trip to the South, where he talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in this speech, one of the things he says is that the Communist Party failed because they lost control of the narrative of their own past, right? And I think because he's a Leninist, he recognizes that if people aren't motivated to give up their own personal interests, it doesn't work. And one of the ways you make people sacrifice for the cause is to make it seem like the cause always had it right. And as soon as you look to the past and see that the party got it wrong a lot, it makes it hard to tell that story. In the lead up to the 20th Party Congress, what did Xi Jinping do? He started a campaign to study the past, right? Now what's so fascinating is that nobody knows that past better than Xi Jinping, but he only wants a version of that past for other people, right? Which is interesting in the sense that if he knows all the secrets, why doesn't he trust other people with all the secrets too? Because nobody knows them better than him, because he was there and he knew what happened to his father. And his father was persecuted extensively by his own party. And in fact, on one occasion, Xi Jinping bragged that he was purged more than Deng Xiaoping. And for people like us, it sounds like you're complaining, but that fails to understand this political culture, which is that suffering is a way of forging. This is the word that they use. And it rededicates yourself to the cause, and it shows how much you care about the cause. So when people would complain about the party in the 1980s, Xi Jinping would say, well, I bet you weren't persecuted like I was in this way. I bet you didn't have manacles on like I did, right? So it's this story of, that party history is all about, the benefits of suffering, but at the same time, he wants a version of this story that's inspiring to people. But for Xi Jinping, I think his fundamental challenge is how you persuade people that you want to go through another round of what he calls self-revolution, which he says is the answer to keep the party to survive as opposed to democracy, when other people might not want to think about forging and suffering and might want to have fun and make money and be materialistic and that kind of thing. And the way that Xi Jinping tries to make the case for the former is by telling a story of the past, which means that he wants only one version of that past to be told.
Another way that we try to get some of these messages better known, which as you say, are already out there in public, is through the kind of thing we do here at the History and Public Policy Program, which is a constant collaborator with Shen Zhihua, and has built a lot of public programs like this around his work to feature some of the research, which, as you say, is out there in the public sphere, but isn't very well known. So we try to do that, especially, again, at the HAP program here.
I look forward to you opening your Beijing branch full of free discussion.
Well, thank you, and again, I want to thank Joseph Torigian for writing the book, for spending time with us this afternoon. We wish you the best of luck with your Xi Jinping book. I know you finished a draft, and now it's going through various edits, and we look forward.
Academic publishers, unfortunately, are a little bit slower than maybe
Well,
some
this
of us
is a
would like.
much anticipated book, and so we need to give them a bit of a nudge if we can. And we look forward to launching and featuring your work when that comes out here. So again, thank you for all that you've done with us. We value the partnership, and thanks to all those of you in the room and those of you online for joining us today.
A real pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.